Hello and welcome to the week 2 weekly video. As I think I mentioned earlier, I'll be uploading these the week before we do the modules. I won't be getting ahead on them because the idea is that they'll be done reasonably fresh and give me a chance to respond to any questions that come in the meantime. Okay, so what's week 2 all about? Well, week 2 is basically about the biggest, most common mistake that law students usually make. It's about defining your question and making sure that when you write a paper, it is an argument. It contains a strong argument, it's persuasive, it's backed up by evidence, and so on. And you might be surprised how difficult this is actually to do. Maybe you're not. But it's one of these things that many students don't do well and can certainly improve on. And part of the problem really is that I think you begin with a lot of misinformation, and well-meaning people teach you very bad habits. So the idea of just sort of researching around a topic, finding all the information you can in it, cramming it into a document and presenting it is not a good way to answer a question. Because you're not answering a question, it's basically just show and tell. Here's a thing I found, here's another thing I found, here's another thing I found. And your conclusion is, well, I found lots of things. And what you need for a research paper is to start with a strong argument. I will prove this by these reasons, and this is what the result will be. And the exercise this week, it really focuses on that sort of issue. And as I said, you've probably had years of school teachers telling you, oh, start with the definitions, define your problem. You don't do that. Unless the definition is the problem in itself, unless this is something where we don't have a clear definition. And part of the problem is that maybe the law has the wrong definition, or different contradictory laws use different definitions. In that case, definition is fine. But you certainly don't waste time prevaricating and padding around those sort of issues in a law essay. Because what you've basically done is thrown away those words, and many people will throw away the entire first page of their paper with just material and information that the reader already knows. So we're going to come back to this topic later on in the term, and we're going to have a look at some of the techniques when you come to editing, because one of the things you do in editing is actually take the early stuff you've written out. And often we write sort of filler just to kind of make ourselves feel better that we're making progress, and at a later date we find we've replaced that with better text. And that's good. That's actually good practice. That's not wasting time or wasting effort. That's iteration, and that's building on that process. Yes, the cough is still with me, unfortunately. So a research paper is a finely tuned machine. It's a machine for persuasion. It's a machine for communication. And it's something you design and create to say, my objective here is to persuade the reader of this particular argument. And to do that, you've got to start with an argument. And that's where we're saying this week. How do you actually create that basic argument, particularly if your topic that you've been given may be reasonably broad and difficult to narrow down. All right. Now I've got another section I'm going to briefly talk about that I'll actually is some new material that I'll add in perusal, and this is a discussion of what are the types of legal research questions that occur in practice, because I think we can end up with a very distorted opinion of this from the assignments we do and the exam topics that we cover in the early years of the degree program, because they've been designed very simply to. And you may not think that if you've just been through first year, but believe me, they're designed in a very simple way so that novices can come to grasp with the law and how the law works. But they're not the sort of thing that occur in the real world. No one says, hey, you, tell me what's the ratio of Donahue and Stevenson, and I'll pay you $5,000 if you tell me. Doesn't happen. And many of the topics that we set are likewise sort of doctrinal and broad, and they are done that way to get you in and discussing and understanding the law without sort of understanding that context. Well, you're halfway through your degree now, and it's time to turn up the volume, turn up the heat, I don't know, and to give you some tools to actually look at some more professional sort of questions that are asked. So one of the myths that we kind of think about in legal research is that all the questions are big, sort of broad, moral, right and wrong questions. You know, is the law right? Does the law need to be changed? Is this law correct? And that's, frankly speaking, really a minority. It's a very, very small minority of what legal researchers do or what legal research is involved in. And there are some like high-profile examples recently. I mean, things like, should marijuana be decriminalised and should marriage rights be extended to all people? Those are pretty high-end, big sort of top-level, is the law right or is the law wrong sort of questions. So they do occur from time to time, but they don't occur that often, and often they actually end up pretty much outside the legal domain in any case, because it becomes more of a political question rather than a legal question. So I think one of the misapprehensions we often have when we start studying law is it's all going to be, about the big issues and what's right and what's wrong and what's just and what's not, and it just simply isn't. And if you do see those questions, I'll say on an exam, my recommendation is to run a mile from them. They look like they're the easiest questions, but they're actually the most difficult, for reasons we can talk about later. You're much better off with a really narrow, well-defined question than you are one of these big, broad, kind of open questions. Okay, so if legal research is not about the big issues, what is it about? Now, I think the issues paper, or the consultation, actually the issues paper that we're looking at this term, will give you some examples of the sorts of questions that are asked. But I've got a list of the sort of types, the different sort of breeds of question, which I'll talk through now, but I'll also put a note on perusal this week to update it. So what sort of questions do we tend to ask? Well, the basic one is, why is the current system not working? So you'll have something that looks good on paper and a law that says we prohibit this or we regulate this, but in reality it's not working. The actual rates of offence or the behaviour we're trying to control is not being controlled. So questions like, why do a large percentage of drink drivers reoffend? Why aren't people paying GST on imported goods? And that's really about the social application of law and the mechanisms for enforcement. And a small variation on that is, what supporting mechanisms do laws need to be effective? And that's looking not so much at whether the law's working or not, but saying, well, what do we need to do in order to enforce the law, to provide information about the law, to provide training for the people who are meant to apply the law? So questions like, how do we explain privacy rights to people? Why aren't safety inspectors applying the new set of regulations correctly? So those sort of research questions are really about the administrative structure, and you've probably all done admin law by now, I think. We know that administration is part of the legal system. Regulation is part of the legal system. Why is that regulatory system not functioning, and what can we do to improve it? And you'll see a few questions like that in the issues paper. Okay, next set of genre of questions: evaluation of alternatives. We've got a system that we don't like, and there's that first question of, well, how do we know it's not working? So we need to establish that. We've got an alternative. Now, how do we establish the alternative is better? And sometimes the only way you can do that is through a trial project, and then using a trial to actually evaluate the different outcomes. But it's never the case where you say, well, we don't like this way we're doing the law, let's turn it around completely and let's change it completely and do something new. There's all sorts of steps that have to be taken before you get that far. And it's often part of the woes of government, who they come in on a platform of saying, we're going to change the law completely, we're going to do this. And the systems of law and administration say, well, it's not as easy as just saying that. And there's actually a whole lot of frameworks you have to change and things you have to put in motion before you change it. So that happens around the kinds of research question where you're saying something like, do neighbourhood justice centres decrease recidivism? Can we introduce those rather than standard magistrates' courts? Would a curfew reduce crime in Indigenous communities? A very contentious claim. So how do we evaluate those claims, and how do we position them in relation to the existing system that is there? The next set of questions are resource and priority issues, where you say, yeah, we have multiple sets of laws, but how do we prioritise them? How do we agree that domestic violence is a problem, but how do we actually put more policing on domestic violence when we only have a limited number of police? when we have to take police away from somewhere to put them somewhere else. Should we regulate Uber? Well, there's arguments emerging around the way these sharing systems should be emerged, but someone has to fund that. Something from the government public purse has to go to create an agency or to support an agency to enforce that. So there are real issues about the resourcing and application of these things. Now, sometimes these are just simply budgetary issues, and they tend to fall a little outside of legal research specifically, because most lawyers are not very fond of Excel spreadsheets and numbers. But as a researcher, you will have to deal with those at some point. But sometimes it's about the legal and regulatory issues of arguing, well, this is where we need to deploy our resources to be effective. So that's another sort of question that can be asked. Another one is the multi-jurisdiction, multi-agency woes, and this comes up a lot in law reform. And that's the area where, particularly in our federal system, and I presume you guys have all studied constitutional law by now, but you'll know in our federal system we have multiple jurisdictions that overlap, but we also have multiple agencies within the jurisdictions, and they're infamous in their inability to cooperate and share information. And again, the issues paper we're looking at is full of those problems where different agencies, different state and federal bodies are all kind of getting pieces of information and pieces of the regulatory puzzle, but they're not putting them together. What can we do to actually help them do that? Sometimes it's administrative structures, and sometimes it means changing the law and using the law to create channels and sharing arrangements where they have to share information. Sometimes a nice handshake and saying, oh yeah, we'll share information goes down well in theory, but unless you actually through legislation require a body to share info with others, they'll often sit on the info because that's sort of like a resource that they have and are often unwilling to share. So the kinds of multi-jurisdictional questions you have are, whose responsibility is it to handle reports of corporate fraud? Who do they share it with? In what circumstances can a federal body take away responsibility from a state body? We know from endless police TV shows that state police hate it when federal police come in and pull jurisdiction. But that sort of thing happens a lot in different fields, even in Australia, where there is joint constitutional responsibility over the same area. Now, probably the trickiest of the kind of legal research questions, I think, is the law likely to change in the future? And that's one that, again, you won't, as a graduate, be asked, really. That's one for high-level consultation, and that's really about looking at the different opinions and weighing up the different opinions of experts in the field. So questions like, will the High Court recognise a right to privacy if they get given the opportunity? Or will the government change the Austudy repayment threshold? These are the kinds of questions that are often things we like to put on exams. How will the law change in the future? But as an actual professional, no one's going to ask you that. And particularly as a junior professional. If you get to be a seasoned expert in the field, someone may have the money to come to you and say, look, I'm going to pay for you to answer this question. I'm thinking of changing my business arrangements, and I want to know how the law is going to change. Is the law going to change? How is it likely to change? Because I want to plan my business out over the next 10 years. But that's definitely not the kind of question that the junior lawyers get asked to answer. So there's a range of the sort of research questions you get asked. I mean, often the questions you ask in practice are not really research questions. They're often around how can we settle this dispute through an agreement, or what are the risks involved in this course of action. And I'm not saying research is not relevant, because in both those cases, the research that you do can put you into a better bargaining position or give you more knowledge. So if you're in a negotiation and your research is strong, you're going to be able to leverage that in that negotiation. But the actual questions you're asked professionally around that sort of information is not the sort where it's go go and look in the library and go through the law reports and study this and find out this sort of stuff. It's like, practically, do you think that other person is going to agree to this compromise position? And that is a large part of legal practice, is working for solutions that are cheaper and more effective than litigation or legal solutions. All right, as I said, I'll put those list of questions into perusal for you to have a bit of a look at and think about. But what I really want you to do out of that is to start thinking more practically around the sort of questions researchers get asked in practice. And when I say in practice, I'm including all the different legal career destinations. Working in a firm, you don't actually end up, a lot of what your work does, a lot of the work that you do is rote work. You learn it once and you do it over and over again. But there are times when these questions come up, and these are the sorts of questions that are asked. They're asked in the law reform area, and that's why we're focusing on them here. And don't expect to get out there into the real world and someone to say, I'm going to pay you some money to do an exam question, because it just doesn't happen. And occasionally I get comments from people who are saying, but I'm studying law. Why are you bringing all this stuff that's politics and involves sociology and involves all these different things? That's not relevant to law. Well, realistically, it is. That's the nature of legal practice. That research questions are multidisciplinary and involve all these things. And if you get out there as a new graduate and you can't answer those kind of questions, you can't use different forms of research, you don't know your qualitative from your quantitative research, then you're not going to be a very effective practitioner, and you're not going to be very employable either. Okay, so what are some of the other things that we're covering this week? Well, we're looking at wicked problems. We're looking at the impact of this idea of wicked problems on what that means for legal thinking, and how we can actually use different disciplines together to solve problems that we can't solve alone. The Manderson reading is a good background on legal research, the history of legal research and where it is and where it's going. It's probably not a surprise that in the past, when most of law graduates went into the legal profession, the focus of legal research was really, really very practitioner focused. These days, when most students are not going to be going into practice but are going to be very employable in other contexts, the challenge has been for law schools to up their game and to actually prepare students for those environments. In the navigating section this week, we're looking at government and law reform papers, so that should give you a bit of some clues onto navigating the resources that we're using this term. And in some of the general discussion, we're going to look at how legal resources are generally work with each other. And I'm going to look at the very simple, I'd recommend the video on the bedtime rule, because it's a very simple way of getting your head around the difference between rules and precedents and how those intersect. Because we tend to study legislation and cases quite separately, and we don't really spend all that much time, because there's so much to get through in the rest of the course, about the interrelationship between them. So it's a good time to actually sit down and go, well, how is the dance between rules and precedents affected? And there's a few tips in the equilibrium section on reading and getting started with your writing. So there's some useful things there as well. So this week's workshop is really, again, getting back to what I said at the start, it's about framing your debate. And it's about trying to construct that research question and to move beyond the show and tell, where you go, I've looked online and here are some things I've found, to moving towards that point where you're actually saying, this is the persuasive argument, the engine that drives my paper. And the first thing we do to do that is to start extracting what the arguments are and what the different sides of those arguments are. Because there's no point going through a problem and going, well, everyone agrees about this, so that's fine. We need to find the real points where people disagree, to find what the different opinions are on that, and then to be able to pull an argument out and to begin evaluating those different positions. And that's the first step towards forming your own position on that, your own evaluation of the situation, and then using what others have said, or authorities or research sources or whatever, to justify that particular stance. I'm arguing that this is the position and this is the evidence I've used for it. But the first thing is pulling those things out and actually looking where the crisis points in the system are, because usually in most legal areas, people pretty much agree about most stuff. Most people agree that terrorism is bad and that we should be keeping the community safe. However, we disagree, and we disagree quite strongly on what measures you can use to do that, and how far should you go, and how much surveillance is justified to pursue that end. So you don't start a paper on terrorism by saying, should we allow terrorism or not? Is terrorism a good thing or not a good thing? But you jump right into the area of where is it that the disagreement is, and let's evaluate those. So hopefully that will be something to give you started, and we can explore this more in the tutorial this week.